Hello and welcome to PerchPeek Pods, the only show where you get in-depth interviews with some of the world's leading global mobility experts. I'm Paul, founder of PerchPeek, the modern way to relocate employees, and today I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Frank Belmonte, Global Mobility Program Lead at Red Hat. Frank, introduce yourself to the community and tell them a little bit about your journey within the global mobility world.
First of all, thank you for hosting me today. And it's great to see a podcast dedicated to global mobility. So kudos to PerchPeek for
thank you, Frank.
Honoring the community.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of interesting people, and when we were sort of brainstorming, I was like, we've got to get Frank on early doors because you have one of the most interesting journeys out there. So tell us about it.
That's good. Thank you. So before I move into in-house, I started my career in global mobility in Singapore in the RMC space. And that was probably before you were still a twinkle in your family. Also,
no comment, Frank.
So I'm looking at maybe around 25 years ago.
Yeah.
So back in the days, if you talk about mobility in Asia, a common notion is that it mainly involves shipment of personal effects. So a lot of the global RMCs we have nowadays really have moving as their core business. So one of the company I worked with at the time, it was they had a flagship account that's based out of North America, and they were sending a lot of expats into Asia. But it was a growth region then, and I think it still is, obviously now. But it is a very complex market with many local market nuances as well. So they depended on their providers to help them guide and administer their assignment policies. So many of these companies, and the one in particular, the one that I work with, they needed to really expand their scope of service and move away from the traditional moving and came up with like destination services and so on and so forth. So that flagship account that I supported at the time, we were doing not only destination services, but ongoing assignment support, including compensation and benefits administration.
Wow.
So, yes, and there were a lot of expats. At one time, if I remember correctly, there was almost like 100 expats that throughout their assignment, we were there, we were supporting them.
Wow, well, amazing. And yourself in this, were you sort of case managing them, Frank? Were you the sort of global mobility coordinator? I know there's lots of different names for the role, but is that what we're speaking about here? Sort of talking them through their benefits, being that quarterback for the relocation?
Yes. So not only in providing direct delivery services, but we were doing compensation and benefits administration as well.
Wow.
So once they are on assignment, if they're like family size change, so we were providing instruction to payroll for change in COLA or transportation or housing allowance payments. And this may not be a common concept now, but they were a homeowner back then. We were providing instruction on housing norm deductions to payroll. So again, it was a very good boot camp for me, getting into the mobility space, although it was I was working in the RMC.
Yeah.
So after Singapore, I moved to Australia, still within the RMC, both in Melbourne and Sydney. And I was supporting employee relocations in the finance, mining, and a beverage industry. So at one time, I had the banker, the miner, and the beer drinkers.
Nice. That's a lovely portfolio.
Yes, it was such an interesting time. And the company I worked with at the time, they also owned the license to sell cost of living data products in Australia. So I learned a lot about the different compensation approach, balance sheet, the net to net, and so on and so forth. So again, it was a good experience for me getting into that space.
Yeah. And Frank, just to dig in there, you've mentioned a couple of times comp and ben in Singapore, balance sheet administration. What are you, as you say, not everyone in the industry is fortunate enough, even in either in in-house or in RMC roles, to cover comp and ben and payroll related activities. Can you just explain a little bit more what were you actually doing for Comp and Ben and for payroll? What was the task you were completing, so to speak?
Okay, so for comment ban is if a traditional expat would normally have a balance sheet approach. So you
Yeah.
basically talk to them about, what their base salary is, what the hypo tax deductions would be, and the housing allowance, what housing norm is, what is the applicable COLA to them, and how we come up with COLA. And some of them can really, they'll dive into understanding how do you calculate a COLA index? Like what's in the basket of goods? So that's sort of like we get into that minutia of really explaining to them what their compensation would be if they're taking an assignment.
Yeah.
To Asia, for example.
Yeah.
So that's sort of like the compensation and benefits.
And for the members of the community that are, they want, because we hear this a lot, they want to learn about some of the more benefit side of things. It can be a common career path for folks from GM. How are you learning yourself about what goes into the baskets of goods for the COLA allowances? Because that can be stressful. Right? How are you learning what to send to payroll for the housing norm deductions? Like, what were you doing at the time?
So at the time, again, the company I work with, they own the cost of living data provider.
Yeah.
A license to sell COLA in Australia. So I got to learn about the approach they did in coming up with an index, like what gets into the basket of goods, right?
Yeah.
So I think if there are a lot of, if many will be interested to learn more about that, we have quite a few cost of living data providers. You have the Mercer, the Airing.
Yeah.
Provide courses to get into the specific details around their methodology and coming up with those information.
Yeah, nice. And have you? Well, this is fast forwarding slightly, but then you had lots of different roles across different service providers. Have you kept on top of your sort of payroll and more sort of tax related skills over the years, or is that something that's less of your sort of day to day now?
No, I think it's more so now, and because after Australia, I sort of took on a regional role in Hong Kong, and then I moved to the UK. Before I moved in-house in Prague and now in Barcelona, Spain.
Wow.
In my role now, we touch more on tax. That wasn't my traditional, sort of like a normal entry point for anyone moving into in-house. A lot of global mobility professionals really come from the Big Four. That wasn't my background.
Yeah.
But then getting into the role, you just have to kind of forced to learn it, really. Because it's just you have to know, you have to understand the concepts about what expatriate tax, what hypo tax is. It's just part of the role. So so I learned more about that.
Well, because I'm going to ask you again about this, and then I want to go backwards again. But so many people are nervous about the tax side of things because A, it's often some of the biggest sums of money, and B, inevitably, I think everyone shudders slightly when they hear the word tax and just gets a bit nervous about it. You mentioned they've been forced to learn it, forced to learn what hypo tax is, forced to learn about expat taxes. What does that actually mean? How are you learning it? Are you Googling? Are you using ChatGPT? Are you leaning on the community? How are you staying on top of stuff?
So, in global mobility, we still have to. We're never going to claim that we are tax expert. Yes. And we are not. In the same way, we're not immigration experts. So we do also work with providers that are experts on those fields. So we partner with our tax providers. So if for example, we have an expat and they come up with a compensation balance sheet, they talk us through around the methodology around coming up with the net salary and what the tax implications are and how how they come about those numbers. So in doing so, you just sort of learn the concept, learn the principle. So that's basically how I get to learn them.
Nice. So just I'm hearing there, not being afraid to get stuck in and not being afraid to speak with your service providers, as you say. You have immigration, you have, but still use that opportunity to absorb the knowledge so you can reference it internally, particularly in your in-house role.
Exactly.
Because
Yeah.
that's super interesting. I want to go backwards because we fast forwarded. So you've gone from Singapore to Australia, domestically moved Melbourne, Sydney. Then you've gone to Hong Kong, UK, Prague, Barcelona. You've been everywhere, man. That is a crazy, crazy journey. Something I know that the community will find interesting is your APAC experience. As you said, still a huge growth area today,
Mhm.
often managed by mobility teams based out of the US or based out of EMEA. And it's often nerve-wracking for folks trying to set up sensible policies that sort of absorb those local nuances. So tell us about your experiences in APAC and what you've seen work well there.
Yeah. So whilst I understand that a lot of companies would like to have like a global policy, right? So it's just to drive like
Yeah,
consistency in their approaches. It's really important to have a regional approach. And APAC, I mentioned earlier, is such a complex market, and there's a lot of local market nuances. So, for example, in your policy, if you have a transportation allowance, does that make sense to apply transportation allowance in a market like India?
yeah,
Or would it make sense to just provide car and driver? If in your policy you cover like school tuition fees, but in Hong Kong there are such certain things as debentures. So who cover debentures for Hong Kong? And if you have housing allowances in China where it's a restricted currency, how do you then make housing allowance payments in such a market? So this is really when you work with your local providers in region to understand how to deliver or to administer some of those policies. I think it's very, very important to partner with somebody who is on the ground with good experience.
yeah. And so very interesting examples there. Let's go back to India and that example because
Yes.
of all the growth markets right now, certainly amongst our client base, India, often both international and domestic, is a huge
Hmm.
driver. So huge country. You touched on go into the example of transportation allowance not necessarily being relevant versus a car and driver, and if you're managing a program from the US and you have a Indian domestic policy, what would you actually be changing?
I would say you should provide less vendor assisted program.
Yeah,
What I mean by that, for example, for Indian domestic, you should ask yourself, does it make sense to have a moving company help them ship the personal effects? Or would it make more sense that your local India associates find their own provider within certain limit, they move themselves and then just submit an expense reimbursement. So
yeah.
that's probably sort of like a different approach in other markets that you support. Um,
And
Again,
what's the benefit of doing that in, say, India, in your experience?
I think again you are understanding the local market,
Yeah,
um, and you are not forcing a policy that may not apply to the individuals that are based in that particular market. Yeah. So again, one of the things that is unique about India, at least back then, is that it's very common to have, if you're providing housing allowances, it's very common that they are paid like 1 year in advance because a lot there's not many supply of expat housing in India.
yeah,
And if they become available, many of the landlords want a rent 1 year paid in advance. So again, you need
exactly.
to change your approach in that sense.
Yeah. And how would you or who would you expect to be filtering that back to the overall program owner? Because I think that's something that we often, you know,
Mm.
internally it can be deemed, the centralized GM team in Prague or in Seattle or wherever it is.
Yeah.
Whereas, they might not necessarily have that knowledge. Like, how does that get fed back that in India you should have something different?
Well, sometimes you know, many of the global mobility professionals, they only found out like once they have already associates in those markets and they be
Ex-
like, hang on a minute, we have to do things differently here, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah, so now I think like through experience from previous transfers that you've managed, that you learn,
Yeah.
different practices, and you need to customize your policy, your approach for that particular market.
Yeah.
Again, it's very, very important to partner with your local providers in those markets because it's ever changing as well, right? Like, does that still make sense? This approach now may no longer apply in future. So,
Yeah.
I think you also need to gather some market intelligence locally.
Yeah, and I think I really love what you're saying around using your local partners. You can tell you've come from a background of mixing in-house and service provider because you don't have to do everything by yourself. There are an amazing network in the community of people that can help, and using them absolutely critical to find the best policy. And then I think the other one I wanted to go back to there was creating a little bit more flexibility for employees to decide themselves, just so that it's less rote. And I think what we've seen in the past is sometimes that can enable you to sort of maintain some of the global consistency whilst having the space for some local flavor. So not necessarily sort of dictating that everyone around the world is always going to have a household goods shipment, because I said that might just not be as relevant in some markets. You touched on another topic that I really wanted to go into. So you mentioned India might well have changed since you were very closely looking at it. Hong Kong might well have changed. China's definitely changed over the past few years. How often do you think global mobility leaders should be reviewing their policies, both overall and at an individual country level?
Yeah. So I would say, I have to reflect in terms of what would be the appropriate answer to that, because within global mobility, we don't have many global mobility typically in an organization. Right?
Exactly.
So we always look at how we are able to scale our operations, right?
Yeah.
So we really are not able to review our policies like as frequent as we probably would want to be.
Yeah.
I think every time there's a big sort of like a change, and typically mobility really gets impacted if there are like world events or regional events that are happening on the ground. And that's probably like a timely means of like reviewing, okay, what are we doing in this particular market? Do we still need to provide housing allowance?
Yeah.
Or or a shipment of personal effects. So I think, but I would say a good practice would be you need to review it at least once a year. Just again, because we operate in a world at the moment that there are so many things happening, and we just want to, make sure that our policy is still intact.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. It's scary for some folks because it can be a big process to review the policy, but at the same time, I think something that we definitely would see as best practice is almost not viewing it as a massive deal to tweak policy. Try and set it up so you have the space. You almost make them frameworks that are easier to tweak rather than 6 months of review, 6 months of implementation of a policy every time, because that just makes it super hard to update over time, and you don't know that. Let's go and go. I want to go back to your incredible experience both across APAC and across EMEA. What do you see as some of the key differences between supporting mobility in APAC? You mentioned some of the regional flavor, and supporting mobility in EMEA, which I believe is a lot of your role now at Red Hat.
Yeah, so I would say I've been fortunate to have been able to work in both regions, in APAC and EMEA. EMEA, in particular Europe, because of the freedom of movement, and a lot of them is driven by EU directive as well. There's a lot of focus on compliance.
Yeah.
And global mobility in Europe may attest to that we are so focused on making sure that we remain compliant in this region. So much so, like, for example, we're not only supporting international assignments and transfers, but we're also providing support to our business travelers. And in my role at the moment, we worked with our tax provider to come up with business rules in terms of when do you do posted worker notification or when do you do A1 for a particular business traveler. So we've added business traveler compliance as a major part of our program now.
Wow.
So, for example, when Brexit also happened, we need to make sure that our EU nationals in the UK or UK nationals in EU continue to have the right to work. When COVID happened, a lot of people wanted to remotely work, and we wanted to make sure that they're not spending way too much time outside the country of employment because there's a permanent establishment risk. So, again, Europe is all about compliance. APAC, most of our program is still focused on providing the type level of support to our employees. So we're driving a successful employee experience. So I think there's still employee experience focused in APAC versus compliance in Europe. I think that's really the big difference.
And I definitely agree. Sometimes I think mobility leaders from either APAC or from North America are shocked whenever their European counterparts speak about posted worker directive or business traveler, and it is funny that is such a big part of the European role. Tell us a little bit about business traveler compliance then, because that comes up quite frequently. Often GM teams being asked saying, hey, we think there might be a problem, with our business travelers, global mobility, don't you know something about that? If you're able to, tell us a little bit more about what taking on that function meant, that rollout, how many business travelers roughly is it, and sort of what you saw work well when mobility took over that function.
So the business travel compliance for business travelers have already existed long time ago. It's an EU directive, but the enforcement of which really is getting more and more focused lately, especially after Brexit, after COVID, and with the freedom of movement, a lot of the EU jurisdictions really want to make sure that companies are not sending their employees to another jurisdiction to sort of like replace their local labor market. So what it's really trying to do is avoid social dumping. So that's mainly what it is.
I love that. Yeah.
So the posted worker, it's a big change management that we needed to implement because we move away from employees just having to book their flights and then fly to now have to go through a tool, do an assessment, then the tool will then come up with an output to determine whether they need a posted worker notification or whether they need an A1. So that in itself is a big change from an employee perspective. Yeah. So again, a lot of focus on change management around it.
Yeah, for sure.
Business travel compliance, I would say, is, again, there's a lot of focus amongst jurisdiction and there's a lot of like hefty fines available.
Exactly. Yeah. And because I think that's something that, inevitably is change management. And if you have a senior salesperson that's traveled around Europe for 20 years in their career, all of a sudden they're told they have to go through this tool and go through an assessment, they're not going to be happy. We see this all the time. They're like, oh, here come the police. They've told me I've got to do this, etc. So that is difficult. But as you say, it is becoming more prevalent. And how do you balance the need for compliance versus the business need, exactly, and the unhappiness that people will generate? Did you deem that the fines were potentially so large that you just had to go ahead with it? How did you make that decision?
Well, again, this is where your company business rules comes into play. So different jurisdictions, they have a different requirements when you should be doing posted worker notification. So for example, I'll just give it as an example.
Yes, I love it.
In Spain, if you're traveling in Spain and you're going to spend 7 days, you must be doing posted worker notification.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of travelers into Spain. You then ask the question, is that a practical approach? If you're only doing 7 days, do you really need to do a posted worker notification? So companies need to look at your level of risk around now. Maybe 7 days or could it be 2 weeks, or maybe a month if it's only business meeting inside your own offices? So I think this is when you need to kind of like balance balance
exactly. Yeah, because and clearly, this is not legal advice, but like the risk of someone going for 7 days is a lot lower than someone going for 3 months or whatever. Just practically, that's the case. Who else is in the room when you're discussing that potential risk? Is it yourself, tax, compliance team? Like, who else is in those conversations when you're trying to decide what length of stay is required for Spain in this instance?
So the approach we've taken, we partner with our tax providers. So we look at what is the law says. Yes, this is what the law says, and what our other companies are doing.
Yeah,
and then we look at, okay, based on what the law says and based on local market practice, we then drive our own business. Yeah, so to determine our level of risk.
Yeah,
and it's within a specific country, depending on your business activity and depending on where you are doing your business activity, where you're inside the office or outside the office, that also drives the result of the posted worker requirement. So we came up with, so you can just imagine the full of exercise. Many jurisdictions and different activities that we have to undertake. But we came up with a rule, and then we have leadership then sign off to them. Then we implement them. Obviously, we revisit our rules.
Of course.
Makes sense. Yeah. So it once implemented, we did say we're gonna like review it like in 6 months or a year's time, whether or not we need to make adjustments to our business.
So you have the flexibility, and that leads nicely to, well, how many employees is Red Hat now? 18,000, 15,000?
Yes, around 18,000 globally.
Around 18,000 globally. I'm sure not necessarily all of them were impacted by this, but it's a big job rolling something like this out and sort of informing everyone that needs to know that, hey, there's this new tool that you need to use to go traveling or go on business travel. What was one lesson you learned from the rollout of this process?
I think it's really important to have employee engagement. So throughout the process, when we knew we're going to implement a business travel compliance program, we actually partnered with our senior leaders from a different organization, the one that will be directly impacted, like the sales and services organization, and make them part of the journey. So before we implement, we let them test the tool. We spoke to them about the principle behind our business rules. And so employee engagement really was very important. So there was no surprise. And they help us also manage the expectations of their own associates. So we have like internal source pages, we're very high on self-enablement. So there's a lot of like knowledge articles out there for them to read about the new program. We, the leadership, already engaged at the onset was really critical for the success. Two
absolute golden nuggets there from my viewpoint. Leadership involvement, because they're so important as a tiebreaker. If someone's not happy, to say leadership there, but to avoid having to go to the tiebreakers, getting them involved early, the key organizations. And that's something that I think we always see with any big implementation, whether it be policy, new vendors, new offices, whatever. There's nearly always one or two departments, countries, whatever it is, that are power users of the particular service, and trying to get them involved early is critical. No surprises, I think you mentioned, is a golden term. We're going to change tack completely now, Frank, because and we're going to look to the future. That was an incredible amount of knowledge on the sort of technicalities within Europe, which is so hard for GM to stay on top of because it is technical. Now we have a great tradition within the pod of the previous guest leaving a question for the next guest to ask. And your question today, Frank, is: imagine you're ahead of global mobility in 15 years' time. What skills and experiences do you wish you had invested in today for your future self in 15 years?
Okay, that's a great question.
A difficult one.
Thank you to the previous guest for the question.
Yeah.
As I mentioned earlier, I think my entry to global mobility is not from the big four.
Yeah.
So, but then being in the role, I just sort of like learn about tax and learn about compliance, and learn about immigration. I think it really helped me a lot to have a first-hand experience in the countries that I work in. So if I would have to think back, I would focus more on experience than skills, and I think that would be the experience to be able to work in the Americas region. So because I've now covered APAC, I've now covered EMEA, I think if I had the opportunity to work in the Americas, I got involved one time in reviewing U.S. domestic policy, but it's just different to understand LATAM, North America. So yeah, if I could, if I have a magic wand and I could think of it, I think if I had opportunity to work in the Americas region, I think that's probably one thing that I would say.
I love that. And I think that's so, as with so many things in life, the best way to learn is by doing. And in our industry, it's often quite achievable to learn by doing, move around, relocate, support different regions. Obviously, it depends slightly on the company and whatever, but a consistent theme from within the community is so much of the learning comes from difference in experience. And if you get the chance to move around, focus on a different area, definitely jump at it with both hands, because no amount of courses, reading is going to replicate the hands-on experience of guiding someone through a relocation to Argentina or wherever it may be.
Exactly. And the cultural context plays a big part to that as well.
Big time.
If you are looking at implementing a policy and for example, in the APAC region, you need to also recognize cultural sensitivity around that.
Yeah.
Because, relationship is very important in APAC, and now you may have to tell some of your global mobility colleagues in APAC that, look, we have this global vendor. You now need to use this global vendor, but that may not sit well with them because they have this relationship with somebody locally. So
exactly,
I think having this kind of experience and understanding those complexities, I think, very important.
Yeah, and comes from getting stuck in, and that leads nicely to the last question I wanted to ask you today, which was you've lived in an incredible amount of countries all around the world, incredible experience across APAC, across EMEA, in-house, on the service provider side. If you had the chance to relocate anywhere else in the world for, let's call it, for 2 years, where would you be going and why?
I would say New York, probably.
New York. Interesting. How come?
Again, it goes back to the fact that I have not really had the opportunity to base myself in the Americas region. So I think New York, if I've been to the main cities like Sydney, Melbourne, Hong Kong, Singapore, London, Prague, Barcelona. So I think New York would be a nice tick in the box.
Exactly. You're going from east to west beautifully across the world. It's like you're really making it happen, and it's such a good what a city. I think many people would be very jealous if you moved there, because it's it's so much going on, and then B, as you say, something that's come through and is so inspiring from this conversation for me is your relentless curiosity to experience global mobility. You just want to absorb and take more on your plate, and I think it can be everyone in the community is always so busy, and there's always a million things going on in our world, but your drive to always be learning new things, trying new places is pretty inspiring, and that's definitely come through strongly today. So a very strong answer. The really enjoyed having you on, Frank. What an incredible array of experiences, and what an incredible array of topics. We've gone from APAC, Indian domestic, through to posted worker directives, through to the skills we need over the next 15 years. So it's been a great show. Thanks very much for coming on. Good job by you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Cheers, Frank. Speak to you soon.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.